Yeah.
Yeah, and I guess maybe it's also worth at this point explaining a bit about how this also relates to the kind of the more physical side of it. Because I know what you're not saying is that it's just chronic stress that's going on. And maybe it's just worth talking a little bit about the interrelation with the psychology side, also with some of the physical kind of factors that are also going on with this.
It's kind of cyclical, and it's a bit of a spiral. We've developed in the clinic a bit of a model between sort of the nutrition and psychology departments of how all of this really fits together. And just to go through that a little bit briefly, I guess you're starting with, say, genetics as the underlying factor there. On top of that, we looked at some of what we call the subtypes. Now, what we mean by subtypes is really predisposing factors that make you more likely to get ill. And those can be both physical and emotional. So people who are just always were real warriors, real anxiety types, if you like. And we know who we are, where that's true. Or people, for example, who have always looked after everyone else's needs before themselves, sort of the helper type, if you like, on the psychology side. And, for example, people who've experienced trauma, that kind of thing. But equally, there are physical subtypes. So sometimes, and I know this was true of you with your ME, having real poor diet and not really looking after yourself, sort of diet and lifestyle factors. People who do shift work, that kind of thing, can really sort of mess up the system. Also, some people will know that from really early on, they had real immune issues. They always were getting sick, or they always had allergies, that kind of thing. So we know that underlying everything else, those predisposing factors will make you more likely, you're like more vulnerable, if you like, to getting ill. So as I say, those can be both physical or psychological, or both, and usually it's a bit of both. As you go on, very often and you talked about overload, and we sometimes describe it as a bit like a kind of load on a camel, or load on a boat. The other loads and triggers will tend to be both psychological and physical. And of course, the one predisposes you to the other. So the more your system's in chronic stress, as we said, things like your digestive system tends not to work as well if you're in that stress state. Your immune system tends to be suppressed if you're in that stress state. That makes you more susceptible to digestive issues and malnourishment issues, not in a kind of proper malnourishment, but the sense of your body not absorbing properly. Also makes you more susceptible to things like glandular fever. In fact, if I look at my own story a little bit, the other factor to what was happening at the time was I was at 13, 14, extremely stressed and working very hard and very much into dance and kind of starving myself, as 13-year-old girls who are into dance unfortunately often do. And there was a whole set of factors going on around the period of time that I got chronic fatigue.
Yeah, it's a different era now, isn't it? 13, 14-year-olds being stressed and having too much to do.
I know, crazy, but true.
Yeah.
And I think that all of these things kind of interlink. So the chronic stress and the stressors, plus some of the physical loads that start to happen, diet, all sorts of physical bugs and viruses and not really absorbing things properly and starting to get food allergies or intolerances. All of these things together build the load on the boat. And that's really what causes, in my view, what ME and CFS really are is a burnout state. Because if you look at ME as a kind of a state, it's really not exactly a disease. It doesn't have a single pathogen. It's more of a gradual developed state, or even a kind of what seems like a suddenly triggered state, but there's usually been a lot of backlog to that happening. So really, it's all of those factors together that cause the burnout.
And also, so far, we've talked about the role of psychology in the mind, but it's maybe also worth talking a bit about the role of emotions. I think that's a whole other kind of section of that. So what do you see as being the role of emotions within this whole picture?
Within the whole picture, I think that for a lot of people, they can be a little disconnected from their body and their emotions. What I really mean by that, because it doesn't mean anything in itself, what I really mean by that is that very often if we're, focused on achieving and doing the best in our job or being the best mum or the best wife or the best husband or whatever it is, we are very often focused outside of ourselves, externally, and we're not paying a lot of time or attention to what's happening inside of ourselves. Now, if we are emotionally disconnected, we're not necessarily looking after our own emotional needs, we're not looking after our own physical needs. The two kind of go together, we're just not paying attention. And in a way, that has to be the case for us to get ill. I often think of it as being a bit of a relationship. So you have a relationship with your body. And very often by the time you've got to burnout, that relationship is in tatters. You know, you haven't been talking, you're not listening to each other, you hate each other, you're not working well together. That's really the relationship that we've often built up towards ourselves.
And I guess for most people at that point, the relationship gets even worse because it's now, you're not supporting me, you're not there for me, and everything else.
Exactly, because, you know, suddenly your body's not doing what you want it to do.